6 hours on the post. Wren Halloway's wrists were bleeding into the rope, and the rope was bleeding into her skin, and the crowd had not moved. Her arms were lashed above her head to the tall hitching post in the center of Abilene's main street. The sun had cooked her shoulders raw. Her left eye was swollen shut from a silver ring across her cheekbone. Dust clung to her eyelashes, like she had already started turning into the earth. She was 22. She had not cried once. Somewhere behind her, a small boy whispered to his mother, "Why doesn't anyone help her?" His mother turned his face the other way. Cassian Fenn stood on the saloon porch with his boot on the rail, fine black coat, silver watch chain, a smile that never touched his eyes. He lifted a folded paper so the crowd could see it. "A debt," he called out. "Her father's debt, and she is the collateral." Nobody answered. Nobody ever did. Behind him stood the Dry Creek Seven. 6 men now, after last winter, but the name had stuck. They were the deadliest gang in the county. A wind moved down the street and lifted Wren's hair. She did not flinch. She had stopped flinching around the 4th hour. Before we continue, subscribe and drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now, where you're watching. I want to know. Now, let's continue the story. Sheriff Orville Pike stood in his office doorway across the street. His hand rested on his belt, near the gun, but not on it. A little girl of maybe 7 tugged at his sleeve. "Please, Papa." He did not look down. He did not look at Wren. He looked at the dust at his own feet, and he stayed exactly where he was. Inside his office, pinned to the wall, was a stack of papers 2 years thick. Names, dates, witnesses, all of it unfiled, all of it waiting for a day the sheriff could not bring himself to choose. The little girl let go of his sleeve. She watched her father's hand not move. Then the hoofbeat came. Slow. 1 horse. A rider came up, the street from the east, unhurried. A gray horse and a gray coat and a hat pulled so low you could not see the man's face. He stopped 10 paces from the post. He looked at Wren. He looked at Cassian. He looked at the crowd that had learned to watch and do nothing. Cassian's smile widened. Cassian had faced down 10 men in his life, and every one of them had gone for a gun inside 5 seconds. This one just sat his horse. His hands rested on the saddle horn. Nothing hurried. Nothing hidden. "Stranger," Cassian called out, "you are in the middle of a private matter." The rider did not answer. He swung down. His boots hit the street. He walked past Cassian's men, past the post, until he was close enough to Wren to touch her. He did not touch her. He looked at the place on her wrist where the skin had opened. A muscle jumped once in his jaw. Then he turned and faced Cassian Fenn. "Untie her! Now!" Cassian laughed. It was a practiced laugh. Nobody joined it. Across the street, Sheriff Pike's hand moved from his belt, and then stopped. The rider saw it stop. The rider smiled for the first time. 2 weeks before the post, Wren was kneeling in her father's wheat field. Silas Halloway was on his side in the dirt, his shirt dark at the shoulder, a knife still in his hand that had never been drawn in anger in his life. She pressed both hands down on the wound the way her mother had taught her before her mother died. The wheat moved around them like water. A hawk turned slow circles overhead. "Papa." He looked at her, and his eyes were already somewhere else. He tried to lift his hand toward her face. He could not. She bent close, so his mouth was near her ear. Back on the post. A bead of blood slid down Wren's forearm and fell into the dust. Cassian pulled a silver watch from his pocket and checked the time without hurry. The wheat field. 1 word from her father, cracked in half. "Fenn, then another. Book. Then he was gone. Wren sat in the wheat with his head in her lap for a long time. When she finally stood up, her knees had left 2 dark prints in the dirt. That night she went home. She knew where her father kept his ledger, 3rd floorboard from the kitchen stove. She had watched him lift that board 100 times. She lifted it. The ledger was gone. In its place was a single playing card. Ace of spades. Cassian Fenn's mark. The post. The sun had moved 2 hand widths. A fly landed on Wren's split lip. She did not move her head. Across the street, Sheriff Pike closed his office door. The kitchen floor. Wren sat with the card in her hand and understood, very suddenly and very completely, 3 things at once. Her father's debt had been paid. Her father had been killed anyway. And something in that ledger had been worth more to Cassian Fenn than $300. Worth more than a man's life. She did not cry. She put the card in her pocket. She began to think about where else a careful man might keep a record. Her father had told her once, never trust a single piece of paper, Wren. She had laughed at him. She was not laughing now. 3 days later, they came for her, 4 of them. She fought. She bit one man's ear half off before a rifle butt to the temple took her to the ground. When she woke, she was on a wagon with her wrists already bound. When they reached Abilene, Cassian Fenn was waiting in the street with the folded paper and a crowd already gathering, and he said, loud and clear, "Her father died owing me. Now she pays." He tied her to the post himself. He took his time with the knots, and when he leaned in close, he whispered one sentence into her ear that the crowd could not hear, one sentence that would not make sense until the sun went down. The rider did not draw. That was the first strange thing. He simply waited, and his eyes moved slowly across Cassian's men, counting, the way a man counts stones in a creek before he steps across. The big Swede on the left, Udo Rask, reached first. The rider's hand moved. The shot came. Udo was on his back in the street before the sound finished spreading. The second man, Harlow Creech, drew from the left side. Faster. His bullet tore through the rider's coat at the hip. A line of red bloomed across gray cloth. The rider looked down at his own blood like he had forgotten it could happen. Then he shot Creech through the throat. 2 men dead. The rider was bleeding. He pressed his left hand against his side and kept his gun in his right. The remaining 4 of the Dry Creek 7 had their hands on their guns, but not out. They were waiting. They had just seen the man who never drew first get hit, and they had just seen him kill Creech anyway, and neither of those things fit in their heads together. Cassian Fenn looked at the rider's face for the first time, and something cold went through his stomach for a reason he could not name. He had the strangest feeling he had met this man once, a long time ago, and walked away thinking he had not. "Sundown," Cassian said. His voice was almost quiet. "You and me. This street, in front of God and everyone. And if you are not dead, the girl walks free." The rider tilted his head. "She walks free now." Cassian smiled thin. "Sundown, or the boys finish her while you bleed out in the doctor's kitchen." The rider went still. He looked at the blood on his hand. He looked at Wren on the post. He nodded once. He walked to her, drew a knife, cut the rope in one clean pass. She fell into him. She weighed nothing. He carried her. The crowd parted. Nobody stopped him. Nobody breathed. Halfway across the street he stumbled. The wound was worse than he had shown, and a woman in the crowd, old Mrs. Ilsa Vance, the seamstress, reached out and steadied his elbow. She said nothing. She looked him in the eye. She was one of the names on the list in the stolen ledger. She knew it He knew it. He kept walking. Doc Merriweather's door opened before he reached it. The rider laid Wren on the kitchen table and then sat down hard on the floor and pressed both hands to his side. Wren opened her one good eye. She saw the blood first, then the rider's face, then the spreading dark stain on the floorboards under him. "You're hit," she said. Her voice was a dry whisper. "I noticed," he said. Doc Merriweather was already at his side, scissors cutting shirt cloth. 3 inches to the left, Doc said quietly, "and you would be dead." The rider did not answer. He was looking at Wren. Wren sat up on the table, ignoring the pain in her wrists, and said the first strong thing she had said in 2 weeks. "The farm. My father kept 2 of everything. There's a copy. I know where." The rider closed his eyes. He smiled, and then he passed out. Wren was on her feet before Doc Merriweather could stop her. "Sit down," Doc said. "You have been hanging off a post for 6 hours." "I have been watching for 6 hours," Wren said. "That is different." She pulled a shawl around her shoulders. Her wrists were bandaged. Her eye was still swollen shut. She moved toward the door. Doc caught her arm, gently. "Child," he said, "what you're about to do." "I know what I'm about to do," she said. She looked at the rider on the floor, unconscious, his blood soaking into a folded towel. "He came for me. Now I go." She did not take the road. She took the alley behind the church, the dry creek bed behind the livery. The path her father had shown her when she was 9, and they had walked into town for the first time together. Always know 2 ways home, Wren. The sun was 3 hours from the horizon. She reached the burned shell of the Halloway farm in 40 minutes. The smokehouse still stood, sooty but whole. She stopped at the back wall. She heard breathing inside. One man, awake, the creak of a bucket. She pressed herself flat against the wood and thought. She did not have a gun. She had one thing. She bent down and picked up a handful of dry straw from the burned barn. She struck. Her father's flint striker. She had lifted it from the ashes of the kitchen, and she lit the straw and tossed it through the open door of the main smokehouse. She waited. She heard Briar Teague curse, heard boots stamping, heard him rush out the front. She slipped in the back. The salt shelf was high on the east wall. She knelt. She found the loose brick, low, near the floor. It came out easy. Behind it, wrapped in oilcloth, was a tin box. Inside the tin box was a leather ledger bound with string. Inside the ledger, folded between 2 pages, was a letter addressed in her father's careful hand to My Wren. "If you're reading this." She did not open the letter. Not yet. She opened the ledger. On the first page, her father had written, "Cassian Fenn, record of receipts, with witnesses. 4 years of payments, each entry signed by a different townsman. Mr. Oscar Bream, the blacksmith, Mrs. Ilsa Vance, the seamstress, Tobias Gant, the schoolteacher." Half the town had signed her father's book, and every one of them had stood in a doorway today and said nothing. She turned to the last page. Her father had written 3 final lines in different ink. She read them. She read them again. Her hand began to shake. "Fenn is not the debt holder. He is a messenger. The man behind him wears a badge, Sheriff Orville Pike, the stack of papers on his wall, the hand that hovered near his belt but would not close. Briar Teague's boots came pounding back toward the smokehouse. Wren tucked the ledger and the unopened letter inside her shawl. She looked at the flint striker in her hand. She looked at the oil lamp on the shelf. She smiled for the first time in 2 weeks. Then she turned the lamp over and ran. The smokehouse went up behind her like a struck match. Wren did not look back. She crossed the dry creek bed with the ledger against her chest and the letter inside her dress pressed to her heart, and halfway back to town, she began to run and did not stop. Doc Merriweather was on the porch when she got there. He had his rifle across his knees. He saw her face and stood up. "He's awake," Doc said. 2 hours till sundown. He wants to stand. I told him he'd die if he stood." Wren pushed past him into the kitchen. The writer was sitting up against the wall. His shirt was off. His side was wrapped. He was paler than the sheets. She knelt in front of him. She opened the ledger. She showed him the last page. She watched his eyes move across the 3 lines. She watched him close his eyes slow and let out a breath that sounded like something he had been carrying for 20 years. "Silas," he said, to nobody, "you clever old fool." He opened his eyes. He looked at her for a long time. "Your father pulled my daddy out of a river once," he said. "No, other way. My daddy pulled his. We were both 7. We have been brothers since." Wren did not answer. She did not have to. "His name," Wren said. "The man behind Fenn. My father didn't write it." "He didn't have to." The writer said, "There's only one man in Abilene who wears a badge and takes Cassian Fenn's money." He tried to stand. He could not. He swore quietly. Wren put her hand flat on his good shoulder. "Tell me what to do." The writer looked at her bandaged wrists, at her swollen eye, at the woman who 2 hours ago could not stand and was now the only person in the room who could walk. "The sheriff's office," he said. "Top drawer, left side, under his spare badge. There is a second ledger, his own. Cassian made him keep one." "Why?" Wren asked. "Insurance," the writer said. "Cassian Fenn does not trust sheriffs. If Pike ever turned on him, the book comes out. Every dollar, every name." He looked at her hard. "Pike will be in the street at sundown, standing beside Cassian. His office will be empty. You have one window." Wren nodded. She stood. At the door, she paused. She turned back. She set the unopened letter from her father on the table beside the writer. "If I don't come back," she said. "Read it. Tell me what he said." The writer shook his head. "No, you'll read it yourself. Tonight." She held his eyes. She left. She crossed Abilene in the long shadows. The crowd was already gathering in the main street for sundown. Cassian Fenn was oiling his pistol on the saloon porch. Sheriff Pike was standing beside him, his face the color of wet paper. Wren slipped along the back of the sheriff's office. The door was locked. The window was not. She climbed through. She crossed to the desk. She opened the top drawer. Under the spare badge, exactly where the writer had said, was a second leather ledger, thicker than her father's. She opened it. 300 entries. Pike's handwriting. She turned to the last page and froze. The last entry was dated today, and beside it, in Cassian Fenn's writing, "Final payment. The Halloway girl. Sundown." The sun touched the roof of the livery stable and turned the dust the color of brass. Cassian Fenn walked out of the saloon with his coat off and his sleeves rolled. 4 men behind him. The last of the Dry Creek 7. Sheriff Pike stood 1 step behind and to the left, where a deputy stands, not where a sheriff stands. From the east end of the street came the rider, on foot, the gray horse left at the edge of town. His coat was open. His shirt was bloody at the hip. His left hand held a ledger. His right hand was empty. He was not looking at Cassian. He was looking at Pike, and Pike could not look back. "Orville," the rider called out, not loud, clear. "Your daughter is watching." Pike's head turned before he could stop it. At the front of the crowd stood the little girl from that morning. Her hand was in her mother's hand. Her eyes were on her father's face. She was not crying. That was the thing that broke him, that she was not crying. She was just looking at him the way his wife had looked at him the night he first took Cassian's money and lied about where it came from. Pike's mouth opened. No sound came. Out. Cassian Fenn half turned his head. Orville, eyes front. The writer held up Silas Halloway's ledger. Half the town signed this. Then he held up a second ledger in the same hand. And the sheriff signed this one 300 times. A sound went through the crowd that was not a word. Cassian's smile went thin. He had not known about the second book. The writer saw him not know. The writer smiled his second smile of the day. Behind Cassian, Kip Hollander, 9 years a Dry Creek man, slowly took his hand off his gun. Then the man beside Kip did the same. Cassian did not see it. Cassian only saw the writer. Cassian said, "Draw." The writer did not draw. The little girl did something else instead. She let go of her mother's hand. She walked out into the middle of the street. 7 years old. She walked past Cassian. She walked past the writer. She stopped in front of her father, and she looked up at him, and she said, loud enough for the whole street to hear, "You told me he was a good man." Sheriff Orville Pike made a sound like an animal. He drew his gun. He did not point it at the writer. He pointed it at Cassian Fenn. "Walk away from my daughter," he said, "or I will do the one thing I have left to do." Cassian moved. Fast. Always fast. His gun cleared leather, and he fired once, and Pike went back through his own office doorway with a hole through his shoulder. The little girl screamed. The writer's hand was already moving. 1 shot. And Cassian Fenn sat down in the street like a man who had suddenly grown tired. He looked at his chest. He looked at the writer. "Who?" he said. "Are you?" The writer walked over slow. He knelt. He leaned close. He said one sentence into Cassian's ear. Only Cassian heard it. Cassian's eyes went wide, not in pain, in recognition. Then they went empty. The writer stood. The 4 remaining men dropped their guns into the dirt, one after the other, and raised their hands. Sheriff Pike did not die. The bullet went through his shoulder and out the back. And Doc Merriweather had him on the table before full dark. He would keep the arm. He would not keep the badge. He would stand trial. His daughter would visit him every week for 3 years, and he would teach her to read from the Bible through the bars, and the town would say later that of all the men Cassian Fenn had broken, Orville Pike was the only one who had bent back. But that was a story for another year. Tonight, the lamps were being lit. Tonight, the writer was in Doc Merriweather's kitchen, and he was dying slower than he had let Wren see. Wren came through the door with Pike's ledger under her arm, and she stopped when she saw his face. Doc shook his head at her, small, once. The bleeding had not stopped. The writer looked up at her from the floor. He was propped against the wall. His breathing was shallow. "You got it," he said. "I got it. Good girl." His eyes were half closed. "Read it," he said. The letter. She sat down on the floor beside him. She took her father's letter out of her dress. It was still folded. She had not opened it. She held it in her lap for a long moment. She opened it. Her father's handwriting. She read it once to herself. Her face did not change. She read it again. Then she folded it and put it back in her dress, and she looked at the writer. "What did he say?" the writer asked. "He said he was sorry." "For what?" "For not telling me sooner." She paused. "He said you were my mother's brother." The writer did not move. Doc Merriweather, at the stove, went very still. "He said you left when I was 1 year old. He said my mother made him promise never to tell me where you went. He said he broke that promise tonight because he was dying, and because he wrote to you." The writer closed his eyes. A long time passed. Outside, someone was ringing the church bell for the dead. "Jem?" he said finally. "Your mama used to call me Jem." "I know," Wren said. "He wrote that too." They sat in silence. Doc Merriweather, quietly, left the kitchen and closed the door behind him. "Why did you leave?" Wren asked. Jem looked at her. His face had more in it than she had seen all day. "Because I killed a man who deserved it," he said, "and I did not trust myself with what I might do next. Your mama made me promise I would not come back until I could be a man a child could look at." He paused. "I was still not that man, Wren. I just ran out of time." She took his hand. Both of his hands. His were cold. Hers were warm. She did not cry. He did not cry. Outside, the street was full of lamplight and people finally willing to look at one another. "Am I going to lose you tonight?" she asked. "You're not going to lose me tonight," Jem said. "Doc says I am too stubborn." He almost smiled. "I am going to stay a while, if you will have me." Wren nodded once. That was all. She stood. She went to the window. She looked at the town that had watched her hang for 6 hours and had, at the very end, sent a 7-year-old girl into the street to do what no grown man had done. She thought about the sentence Cassian had whispered to her on the post. "Your uncle is coming, and he will bury you with your father." And she understood, finally, that Cassian had not known. Cassian had thought he was threatening her. He had been calling a man home. She turned back to Jem. She sat down beside him. She took his hand again. The lamps burned. The bell rang. The night came in soft around them, and for the first time in her life, Wren Halloway was not alone in it. If this story moved you, leave a number 1 in the comments, and if it feels right, you're welcome to subscribe.